Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to talk about Jasbir K. Puar's notion of homonationalism, which is super relevant today to understand the various ways in which quote-unquote Western nations use the rhetoric of gay liberation and the end of homophobia, ostensibly, to justify continued colonial and imperial oppression of many people across many parts of the world, mostly though people in the Middle East and in the global South. But really, you got to let me know in what ways this term is applicable to you, because really one of the most effective ways to engage this term is to grapple with the many different ways that it can be used to understand various imperialist moves, and at a more local level, the various ways in which racism manifests even within communities fighting for like gay rights, for example. As important as those projects are, of course, there are limitations to them. And there have been these histories, these entrenched within these movements that have really reflected not really equality for everyone, but really equality for the most privileged of these communities. But yeah, I'm going to get into that. Before jumping into it, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical concepts and ideas and ways to make them accessible to you. So if you're new here, you can like, share, subscribe, and see videos I release every couple of weeks if you're into that. If you found this as a podcast, you'll be able to find the video on YouTube. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it as a podcast where there shouldn't be ads, but I've been having issues with that. In any case, go check it out. You can follow me on other places, links in the description. Also some places you can donate in the description. That would be really great. I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, let us jump right into Jasbir K. Puar's term here, which she develops in her book called Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times, in which she writes in the post-9/11 period and looks at the ways in which the United States was deploying the rhetoric of queer liberation to justify inflicting violence against people in Muslim countries. Now, there's really, it would take a whole lot of time to really unpack this, hence why I've covered this book in its entirety, or it will be in its entirety in a couple of weeks, on this channel and on podcast form. So you should go listen to the whole thing. But suffice it to say that for now, the logic of anti-discrimination rhetoric was in this case less meant to actually end things like homophobia in the United States, and more as a way to justify the continued slaughter of people in Iraq and Afghanistan, or today, and even back then, of course, people in Palestine. So one of the most exemplary figures of this that has been really circulated over and over and over again is the way that IOF soldiers who are occupying Palestinian territory brandish the pride flag once they have colonized that territory and once they have murdered, indiscriminately murdered innumerable people. They then spread the pride flag out and say, like, look, this territory has been liberated from these evil people that are caught in their traditions, that are too much bound to their own fundamentalism, that they are unable to open themselves up to the spectral light of modernity. And that's a key component here within the rhetoric of homonationalism. It is selling the idea that quote-unquote Western nations stand in for enlightenment and modernity and progress, while every single other nation and their attending ideological frameworks are bound to the past and are not actually opened up yet to all that the West has to offer. Now, the most immediate irony to this is that gay marriage was only made legal in the US 10 years after Puar wrote this book, approximately 10 years afterwards. And in Israel right now, gay marriage is still illegal. So what's going on here? You know, clearly this actually has nothing to do with liberating gay people or ending homophobia, but instead using the rhetoric of gay liberation and of ending homophobia and queerphobia in the service of continuing empire and of expanding state power. Because when you're able to paint your enemy in a way that describes them as being caught in the past, being what, Netanyahu said is children of darkness, for example, you are then able to more easily manufacture consent for the continued violence against them. Hence the very important role that homonationalism serves in justifying these efforts. Now for Puar, the story doesn't end there. because she looks as well at many gay rights groups, specifically after 9/11, that were falling victim to these same discourses. So for example, she looks at some groups that were more concerned with the fact that the military in the United States was discriminating against gay people on the basis of being gay. Then they were concerned about the fact that this same military was going into Iraq and carpet bombing Iraq and murdering countless people there. And their concern then reveals that, it seems less about an actual project of liberation, which would mean accounting for racism and colonialism and American hegemony and Western supremacy and violence, all of these things. And it seemed more about simply trying to reflect the interests of a small sect of even queer folks in these settings in order to proffer them up and to continue these legacies of white supremacy, class supremacy, ableism, that are the most privileged groups within these subsets, which reveals that in a lot of cases, the rhetoric of homonationalism, as I've already said, has not been about actually liberating gay and queer people in any way, shape, or form. It is instead about appropriating that rhetoric to conceal the continued prominence of homophobia and queerphobia in these settings, and to displace queerphobia and homophobia over there, to say that, oh, we aren't homophobic here. No. Homophobia is found in those places over there. But don't worry, our military is there now and they're going to deal with it. They're going to make it okay. They're going to handle this for us. But perhaps her most incendiary claim here is that she looks at the history of queer movements and says that, they are incredibly white historically. Which is, we need to complicate this immediately and to be like, well, what queer movements are you really looking at? Are they actually reflective of all queer movements? But she, looking at the more mainstream ones, which is somewhat problematic, obviously, but she's right in that many of them were really interested in maintaining a kind of white supremacist attitude and community here, where she looks at even the rhetoric of queerness and its history and how it embraces this logic of transgression, which also happens to mirror the logics that underpin US global hegemony, where the US is able to say and tell the world it welcomes things like transgression, it welcomes things like opposition to norms and tradition and all of that, while everyone else is stuck in their traditions. So the very identity of the queer subject, which for Puar is a queer white liberal subject, is one that stands in for American hegemony, in the very notion of them transgressing boundaries. And what underwrites all of these ideas is the assumption that there are no queer people in those other settings. In this case, she's writing about the United States' perception and the West's perception of the Middle East, that there are no queer people there, which is not true at all. That queerness looks a very specific way, when in those settings, being queer looks a whole bunch of different ways, not to mention from country to country, from region to region, what queer politics might look like in some regions of Iran versus Iraq versus Afghanistan versus Palestine might look totally different. But these differences are totally erased and denied when they are reduced to this homogenous mass of people stuck in their traditions, which is part of this homonationalist script to offer a kind of heterogeneous American identity measured against a homogenous, restricted Muslim identity. And in doing so, it just feeds into these older Orientalist scripts of the West's perception and approach to the Muslim and Arab world, and really collapsing these two things together to justify continued exploitation of these people and lands, and really dispossession and extraction of resources. So this all kind of comes to a head for her, specifically given the title of the book, Terrorist Assemblages, in the figure of the terrorist, where she says that the terrorist is described very, interestingly and counterintuitively as a very queer figure, where the terrorist is often described as this sexually uncontrollable, ambiguous person that isn't guided by any kind of strict kind of regulations or codes or anything. And so in that way, she's like, if we're just following this logic of queerness as transgression, as opposition, as everything like this, The terrorist figure is a queer subject, but they aren't recognized as such unless it is to diminish them as being a bad queer or not being the proper kind of queer subject. That is one that transgresses in a way that doesn't match the proper kinds of transgression permitted by the white liberal subject in those other settings, like in the quote-unquote West. And yeah, in short, this term describes the state's use, and also beyond the state at the more local level, the ideological use of the rhetoric of gay liberation and ending homophobia to justify continued violence specifically against people in Arab nations, and how this is continually used today, especially in Israel's genocide of Palestinians and continued occupation and dispossession of their lands, using this rhetoric to bolster themselves, not only to justify their own continued expansion in those territories, but also to conceal the ways in which these states, like in the West, are extremely homophobic still, extremely homophobic and queerphobic. And when they do recognize these categories, they do so with only kind of careful limits. And again, check out the episodes I've done on this to see the more full-fledged explanation. But we see in much of the anti-homophobia discourse, we see like this emphasis upon certain kinds of gay couplings as being permissible. Not all, and only if gay couplings occur in like private, not actually extending this into the public sphere. And all of this works to conceal how homophobia and queerphobia are still very much alive in those settings, while aligning them and identifying these homophobia and queerphobia in these other settings to justify committing continued violence against them. And yeah, that's a snapshot view. Let me know what you think. Is there anything I got wrong? How this term might be applicable in other cases? Do you see it occurring anywhere else? Let us know. Add to the comments. It can be a whole repository of good insight. That's the key here. But yeah, if you like what I did, like, share, subscribe. Tell your friends. Who knows? They might like it. And yeah, peace.